Hi, it's Reverend Will McGarvey and Reverend Margaret Niles from the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County talking today about interfaith work and especially a little bit about your chaplaincy work, Margaret, and a little bit about grief, and especially in this season of caring for COVID-19. So thanks for taking some time with me and thanks for the work you do in the world. Can you introduce yourself and share with folks some of that
Absolutely.
work?
Yeah, thanks so much, Will. So, as Will said, I'm Reverend Margaret Niles. I'm a chaplain, prefer to be called Chaplain Margaret. And I was ordained in the Chaplaincy Institute in Berkeley. And throughout my time in seminary and since seminary, primarily the work that I've done as a chaplain has been in a hospital setting with folks who are young and needing something from the hospital, or quite old and in the end of life, and everything in between, which includes a lot of different religious perspectives, including non-religious or spiritual. So that's been an amazing learning experience for me. And I should also say that I'm a Buddhist. I'm a Zen Buddhist, and my practice is as an interfaith minister, but my personal spirituality origination is Buddhism. So those two things play a lot with each other, and I can talk a little bit about that. Um, and some of the other pieces, some of the other places that I've been doing chaplaincy work include the San Francisco Night Ministry, which is an organization that allows us the privilege and grace to walk in the evening hours between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. with the homeless community in the Tenderloin. So while that sounds fairly intense to a lot of people that first hear it, it's actually a really beautiful and spiritual and connecting and wholly inspired experience. And that's exactly what my experience was doing that. I've also worked with the Gubbio Project, which is also in the Tenderloin. It's a sacred sleep project that allows the homeless community some time for some real true rest. So they can come in at 6 a.m. and have a pew to themselves in the church, St. Boniface Church. And they're really offered some safety and quiet and love and compassion. So that's a pretty special space to be in as a chaplain as well. There are some other pieces of work I've done here and there as a volunteer, so not necessarily specifically as a chaplain, but that includes end of life and hospice care for children. And that includes some work at the George Mark Children's House, where I work with kids in the spa who are needing care, needing respite, or just close to the end of life. So these are some of the different spaces I've been in. And in particular, did you want to share anything, or do you want me to just launch into what I'm thinking? Well,
I'm fascinated. Keep going.
okay. So one of the probably one of the reasons that Will and I are talking with you is what's happening in the world right now, and COVID-19 and sheltering in place. Certainly, we are here in California, and I I'm in particular really connected to the idea of separation. So we experience a lot of general separation in our life around suffering and grief and loss, losing the person who has died or left us, losing familiar experiences with these people, experiencing separation and loss of what our future is going to look like. And so you can put this, what I'll call normal time experience of suffering and grief and loss, and you add on top of it COVID-19 and sheltering in place, and everything is kind of expanded and exploded out, where we have a separation from people we love, from activities we love, from work, which is like familiarity and habit. And all of these things are, to me anyway, extremely nourishing to our well-being day to day. Even if they're things we don't like, they're familiar, and we really kind of hook into them. So I think that this topic of grief and this time of COVID and sheltering and being separated from so many things in our life, it's important to take a breath and to really embrace, how do we think about this? How do we hold this? How can we hold it better? Just to relieve some suffering, if possible. So there are a lot of different pieces that I could go toward, and keep going.
Well, we're also
Like,
relational animals, right?
Say that
And
again.
we're relational animals,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
we it's hardwired in us, this need to be in relationship. I think that might be one of the reasons why, for folks that are sheltering in place alone or separated from their extended families, why they're feeling the isolation or the alienation in greater ways,
Yeah,
and especially for those that don't have access to technology and the broadband gap in our country, for those that have technology and those who can work at home versus those who have to work on site, and especially those essential workers that are doing so much right now in the grocery stores and the hospitals and county health departments. There's just so many folks. It's a different reality for almost all of us,
it
right?
is.
Depending on
It,
where we work and how, if we're able to shelter in place.
yeah, and even just the resource of knowledge. Some of the people in the older community aren't able to figure out how to get on a FaceTime call without a lot of tension and anxiety and feeling like they don't know what they're doing and they're supposed to know what they're doing. So yeah, there's just a lot of change, and it's happening differently for different people, but it's impacting all of us in very different ways. And even that's a separation of, like, I don't know how other people are doing. When I hear people say we're all in this together, we're absolutely not all in this together. We're all in this and we're all together, but we're all experiencing this. Even in my own home, there's 7 of us quarantining, even just the 7 of us are handling this differently and needing different levels of care and different kinds of care. I was listening to Glennon Doyle. She's an author, and she's written a few memoirs, actually. And she says, we are all a part of each other. And it just hit me this morning when I heard her say that. Like, we're all a part of each other, like you said, Will. And when we get separated in this way, it's very painful, and it's very uncomfortable and very unfamiliar. So that's a big piece. Yeah.
Do you think we're starting to grieve potential loss even now, regardless of whether or not we've actually lost someone that we know? I've heard that it said in New York that half of the people in New York City know at least one person who's died. And I don't know that we've experienced that here on the West Coast in that same way. But it just makes me wonder if the fear of losing someone leads to some of that heightened anxiety and even preparatory grief
Yeah,
for
we
some
call it
of us.
anticipatory grief, right?
Okay.
And it, again, this is something we have all the time. So when you're caring for someone actively, and you're actively caring for an older parent or relative, even before they pass, caregivers are experiencing deep anticipatory grief. They know this is going to happen, and they don't wait for it to happen necessarily. And people who are dying will experience grief in anticipation of the kind of impact their death is going to have on their family members. I think right now, as you were talking about it in New York, very similar to 9/11. I lived on the East Coast and in the New York metropolitan area during 9/11, and everybody knew someone who was impacted. 4 kids in my kindergartner's classroom, or 3 people in the neighborhood, and so there's this collective grief that we're not attending to, because it either hasn't happened yet, or it's happened but we're not in that person's home grieving with them. We're not sitting Shiva. We're not at the cemetery together. And
Or we can't be because of the separation orders,
exactly
right?
exactly we can't just show up and and hold someone's hand and just hug them and be with them. We can't do that anymore.
Or do
So
memorial services or funerals that are so important for collective grief and celebrating someone's life. I think that might be one of the biggest fears, is that if we do lose someone, we might not be able to have a memorial or a funeral for them where all of the parts of their lives could be celebrated.
absolutely. I think the good news, a little bit just from my own experience, is that we couldn't do that in 9/11 either, because there were no necessarily, in most cases, no remains. And it wasn't until a few months later that we started having memorials for people we had lost in our community. And they were attended by thousands of people. And to me, that speaks to this idea that we have rituals we need to exercise our grief, and to witness and honor our grief. And it really goes across all spiritual practices and no spiritual practices. You can be an atheist and show up at a memorial in a church and just feel like you're finally with people who knew this person, and it matters a lot. Um, so yeah, so I think that's something that I can look forward. I know, I have a knowing in me that we're going to get there. We're going to have ways of caring for each other and for ourselves and for the people that we've lost in the future. It doesn't necessarily need to happen in the moment. But, for some people, it really did need to happen. And they did want to be holding the hand of their spouse of 63 years, and they weren't allowed in. And that's a whole other grief. So, yeah. Yeah.
Do you see any new ways folks are making meaning around life during these times, around the loss, the grief, the change that's
So,
making a difference for you?
um, yeah, I was reading about this week, and the classic Kubler-Ross stages, not necessarily in order, but just these stages of grief that are pretty classic stages of grief. And the last stage, so yeah, it's denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, acceptance. But then there's meaning. And I believe, because these don't happen in order and somehow you get to meaning and everything's going to be okay. But in the midst of all of the denial and anger and acceptance, and there's these beautiful moments of, I think, especially with nature, people who can get out of their home and have a space to walk in that includes some nature. They're talking about it all over social media, and they're writing about it, and they're photographing and sharing on Instagram, like incredible photographs of nature. Moments of connection with family members at home that they had been missing. So of course there's a shadow side of difficult family situations, stressful family situations. And I'm not talking about those in this particular moment, but finding meaning in slowing down and noticing what your body needs, and noticing the beauty that exists either in a person or in cooking again because you didn't have time, or taking a walk. So I think people are, my sense, my experience is that people are making a lot of new meaning out of things that really were around them all the time. And we can get very distracted and busy in our lives. So, yeah, just, and when we can make meaning, I think we begin to understand the world differently, and we begin to understand ourselves differently. To hear someone say to me last night in response to a question I had, saying, I really needed more sleep than I was getting. And I told myself a story for decades that I only needed a certain amount of sleep, and I just think I was wrong. And so I think when we start to understand ourselves differently, we understand the world differently, and vice versa. So I think that's really a powerful piece.
I love these stages of grief.
Mhm.
These are some pictures of it: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance. And they've done, Kubler-Ross and the grief cycle has done a lot
Mm-hmm.
as far as helping people accept that. But I also love this image a little bit more, that instead of this bell curve where everything's nice and tidy between, and you end one stage of grief before you enter the next one. Most people's experience is all over the place, right?
Right.
And
In fact, every person's experience is not in order. It's in their order, but it's not in any other order.
there's no wrong or right way to do it.
No, no, there
And
isn't.
that's why you can be fine 1 minute, and the next minute it feels as if like a tidal wave of grief just washes over you, like you're sitting at the beach. And minutes ago you could watch your grief and play with it out there in the shallows, but now it's up to your nose and
The
too much.
a bereavement group I worked with for children, they called themselves wave riders, which I just
Mm.
love, because the kids don't need to know before they start what that really means, but what it really means is that grief is wave riding, and you got to keep your knees bent when you can and when you remember, and it's gonna come when it comes, and abate when it abates. So yeah, I love that image that you just showed. It's really accurate. I wanted to say one thing specifically that I've learned from my Buddhism about how, in particular, grief from the loss of a loved one, is particularly difficult. It's such a abrupt and complete ending. You lose a job, you get another job, and it's abrupt, and it's it can be devastating. But nothing quite like death. And one of the things, as I researched and studied grief and as it related to Buddhism specifically, was my own thought, which was, when someone dies, it's a really, really not great time to start embracing Buddhist ideas. So, for example, the idea that everything in life is impermanent, if you haven't spent some time holding that in your hand like a Rubik's Cube and talking about it and questioning, and how does that really seem to me? Does that make sense to me? When someone dies, that's a really hard time to try to start understanding what it means that everything in the world is impermanent. And I mean everything. And the other is mindfulness. And I think right now people are learning, being stuck at home, being at home, is a kind of mindfulness. And just like going to a 10-day Vipassana retreat where you're silent and meditating for 10 days, this is very similar. You're not necessarily where you want to be. Your mind is very much in control of you rather than you of your mind in most cases. And I'll speak for myself. And so the idea of practicing mindfulness in the midst of a new grief, having never practiced mindfulness or even thought about it, or to see if it makes sense, very difficult time. So I just want to say, people will say, oh, well, you should have a Buddhist approach to everything, because, and then, nirvana and everything will be great. It's not real if this is your introduction, is this major loss. So I would encourage all of us, in the moment of something bigger than we are, or that appears to be bigger than we are, to show up where you are, and to not let anything around shoulds and ought tos to overpower what's actually really happening, which is deep grief.
I
So
call
I
that
would
the
encourage.
woulda, shoulda, couldas.
Yeah, and there's this great quote, Roshi Joan Halifax. I don't know if I can find it, but she has this beautiful quote where she says, "To deny grief is to rob ourselves of the heavy stones that will eventually be the ballast for the two great accumulations of wisdom and compassion."
Mm.
And meaning we it's a transition. This is a transition, and death is a transition, and birth is a transition. So if you've ever known anyone or are yourself someone who's delivered a baby, we all know transition is the hardest part of labor. It's the last 10%. And it's the hardest, most doubting moment. And it's the most important. It's the moment where if you stick with it and get through that piece, you've like Joan Halifax says, you've kind of centered and bounded yourself into the deepest learning around compassion and wisdom. Another favorite old boss of my husband and mine used to say around cleanup, it's the last 10%, people. The last 10% is the hardest and the most important. And it's all the same message. When we get to that point, and weirdly, I think in COVID, we're at that point every day. It's like every day feels so unsure and so tenuous and unclear. We don't have a lot of information. That sticking in and being present to what's actually happening is our only ticket through, really. And we have to just go through. Yeah.
And even in the midst of that, the spiritual practices that have fed us in the past can be the foundation upon which we experience the present and help continue us into the growing ability to be able to remain in the now rather than worrying too much about the past or too much about the future. Sometimes it's those spiritual practices that see us through, regardless of what culture or tradition or life philosophy we use.
And a lot of people are not able to do it because, Easter is a really big ritual for a lot of people, and they were not able to be inside a church. Luckily, Passover, we were able to have a Passover celebration for people in our house who celebrate that holiday, because we were so many people. But pretty much everybody else, they've had Passover Seder with their parents for 60 years and couldn't. So while I agree that our rituals and our habits and our structures and the meaning that our spiritual practices give us and can carry us through this, also there needs to be, in many cases, some adaptation. People who couldn't go to confession, for whom that's an important understanding and belief and ritual, they've needed to get some information that's different about what to do. So yeah, this is really gotta keep our knees bent on this one. This is a hard, I think we're gonna learn a lot about ourselves, and I'm really hopeful. And certainly as a chaplain, I'm used to being on the other end of the phone and holding that space for people and believing in my heart that they're going to come through this and have a sense of centeredness, and that if they're ready, it can feel okay to them. But until that time, I can be with them in that discomfort, because all of these things are really alive to find meaning and to make sense of what we believe, and that there's hope is kind of the beauty of the whole game, I think. Yeah, so it was really hard when chaplains were the only ones left in the room, and then they could only be at the nurses station, and then they were asked not to come on the floor. It's like we've been restricted more and more, and that's, I think, been really hard for doctors and nurses and chaplains and lots of people who want to do their job in a different way than they can right now. Parents, teachers, so many loving folks out there who are trying their best to do something they really didn't sign up for. Teachers didn't sign up to teach online. This is a real struggle for teachers. They want to be in classrooms with their children. And parents weren't expecting in this month, in this time, in this year, to all of a sudden have their kids home 24/7 trying to teach them things that they weren't expecting. So it's just very challenging.
Especially if they have to work at the same time. Or if they're a part of a sandwich generation caring for elders and young ones at the same time.
And our older children are caring for their younger siblings. And that's also something they're not necessarily knowledgeable about. They're doing it anyway. But yeah. And then there's our homeless community who, if they felt outside the system before. Yeah.
The folks in our parking lot program right now are the most at risk, and there's not even places where they can go to the restroom throughout the day anymore. Even restaurants and Starbucks aren't available to them any longer.
Yeah. Yeah. Restaurants are closed for food and for restrooms, and yeah,
So any wisdom you want to leave us with as we wrap up our conversation today?
I think what I wish people would remember or know for the first time is that is this idea that you're enough. So whether that means you're home and working, or home working and caring for others, or whether you're on the phone with someone who has lost something really big, that however you show up, if you're showing up with love, it's enough, because it's what we can do. And I just wish somehow I could send it out into the universe that like, just show up for each other. Just to say, I don't know what to say, is all you need to say sometimes. And just to say, boy, I wish this were different too. I'm here. I don't need to get off the phone or FaceTime or whatever we're on. So that's my wish, is that you are enough as you care for people and as you work, and you are enough as a friend to be a witness, a non-judgmental, authentic witness in other people's lives. So that's my wish.
May we be gentle with ourselves as we are with others.
Maybe so.
Thank you so much, Reverend Margaret. Chaplain Margaret Niles.
You bet. Thanks, Will.
Thanks for being on our council.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yep. With Metta.